Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Mr. Salman Ahmed, the Global Head, Macro and Strategic Asset Allocation with Fidelity International.
Thank you very much. Firstly, it was lovely to hear Iqbal in Karachi, so thank you for that. So this is my 15th country since the start of the year where I've been discussing global macro and asset allocation trends and obviously affecting world order shifts. And I was actually the most nervous today compared to any other country I've been, and I have to do another 15, to be honest, in the next 2 months. And the reason being is that, of course, it's the times, it's the location, it's the place. And I was practicing my introduction speech, but then it seems like a lot of us are from Cambridge today. So I was discussing with my dear friend, Professor Kamal, and he said, just scrub that introduction. So I'm going to start with a new introduction. And the introduction is with a joke, actually. And this is with Simpsons. I'm sure you've seen the Simpsons cartoon series. So Simpsons had a superpower, a new hero with a superpower. And that new hero with a superpower was called Mr. Hindsight. And Mr. Hindsight was excellent in explaining what has happened in the last 20 years. And he was articulate, looked at all the parameters and told you, this is exactly what is happening. And everybody loved him. Then came Mr. Foresight, trying to tell exactly, what are the parameters, what are uncertainties, what are the how do we navigate that. And unfortunately, Mr. Foresight was locked up, because he was not in sync with the times. So I am wearing a Pakistan pin. So after this presentation, I hope I'm not locked up. So let me start. I think whatever we know about economics, about global finance, capital flows, trade, I think we should just forget about it. The world is changing, and I think it's a very overused term, but it actually, I would argue, it is not changing at all. It is actually going back to the way it was. And let me start. Let me go to the next slide. So what I call this new era is the return of the titans. So what are the return of the titans? These are the titans which were locked up in the bottom of the ocean as economics took hold and said efficiency, competitive advantage are the driving forces of economics, capital flows, and trade. I think that is changing. The old titans are back. They are power, sovereignty, security, and control. And if you don't believe me, just look at the FT headline today, where the incoming German chancellor is saying that they want independence from the US. This is a major, major development. And the question to my mind is, who will wield this power most effectively? And now let me go through some of the key dimensions of this new era, which I call the return of the titans, are going to play out. First, the end of economic neutrality. Globalization is not inevitable anymore. So any planning exercise, any modeling exercise which relies on the assumption that globalization is inevitable is false. Or in fact, maybe a symptom of self-denial or delusion. It is no longer an unquestioned virtue, And the reason is very simple, that the voters in the developed world and the Western world do not think so. Economics is a tool of state power by major power players. US isolationism and protectionism is here to stay. And I've been spending most of my time in Europe over the last few weeks, and I've had a lot of pushback against that view, but frankly speaking, not anymore over the last couple of weeks' developments. How the Russia-Ukraine situation settles, what happens to Greenland, are going to be major forces which will shape the economic relationships between the major blocs of our era. So what am I talking about? The two major economic blocs here. Europe will need a new economic and security model. The question here are, will they turn away from free trade as well? And I will go through some of the tariff risks which are playing out, some of the details which are coming through. But one thing is clear, defense spending is going to shoot up. And according to our estimates, if the 5% of GDP target is met, you're talking about an additional euro $700 billion spending in defense per year. This is huge. China actually has been more prepared for what is happening currently than many give it credit. But China has been shifting as well. It has been shifting from a factory to a fortress. And that has major implications in the next 5 to 10 years. But with the advent of technology, AI, and I'll touch upon that, things can happen much faster than we realize. Now, the key paradigm realities I want to share with you and challenge all this globalization, free trade, competitive advantage, factors which we have been taught and we have lived through, I think are being challenged in the way whereby supply chains focused on reliability and security are far more important. Where do I buy my food from? Where do I buy my defense from is important. Not everybody is equal in this game. Capital flows will become political, and technology will be seen as a national security asset, which means countries can be cut off from AI. Countries can be cut off from innovation. Now, why is this happening? You know, we talk and think about EM a lot, and I completely agree with you in the sense that EM has been seen as very strong growth and versus developed countries. But outside of China and some Southeastern Asian countries, including Malaysia for sure, not so much. There's only one game in town, and that is the might of the American consumer. The reason why we are having trade wars, why we are potentially having geopolitical conflicts, which are going to escalate potentially in the next weeks or months, is because the American consumer just keeps on consuming. So American consumption as a percentage of world consumption is 31.4%. Where is the EM here? Where is the rise of the emerging markets here? It's all America. In fact, Europe's share of consumption has declined massively, especially over the last 15 years. And it is paying a price for that vulnerability. China certainly has risen sharply, but China's share of consumption as a percentage of its own GDP has been falling as China has relied on investment and external sector. You cannot be an economic superpower if you are producing and running current account surpluses versus everybody else. That's not how superpowers work. And that's why you need to go back to the return of the old titans label I mentioned earlier. Now, let's map the current trade war, because I think it's going to be very important and it will shake a lot of people into reality once they are hit by punitive tariffs. Now, US trading partners' tariff differential with the US varies by countries. So Turkey, India are actually highlighted as one of the countries which have very protectionist regimes, and US wants that to be rebalanced. And now we can argue whether it's the right thing or wrong thing. The liberal economic establishment is fighting against it, but frankly speaking, they have lost that argument. Now the question is to dealing with the implications of that shift we are seeing. Pakistan, interestingly, is not that high in terms of the protectionism versus other countries. But the countries you need to be worried about are that export heavily to the US. So Canada, Mexico, you can see, are off the charts. And that's why they are scared because of that tariff risk, because they can be pushed into recessions by an action of your trading partner. Now, luckily, Pakistan is not that vulnerable. So, because we never played the globalization game, right? The globalization game was played by China, was played by Southeast Asia, was played by India to a certain extent in services, but Pakistan didn't play that game for multiple reasons. Now, what are the kind of tariffs we are talking about? And here we have done some scenario analysis. So the rhetoric was very strong. In fact, if the rhetoric had been followed, we would have gone into the tariff rates of 1930s in the US. Now remember, US is the biggest consumer in the world and remains so. No matter what people tell you about emerging markets, that's not true. I showed you the chart. US is the mighty consumer in the world, and they are willing to leverage it. So what we are expecting is a significant shift up in tariffs US applies on countries. We are likely to see more tariffs on China. We are very likely to see a significant trade war with Europe, which may turn into a capital war as well, which I will highlight in the worst case scenarios. Now, very short term, what we have to look at is if in the tariff definitions, the US adds VAT or GST in it or not. So currently, there is a very significant push in the US to add GST so GST meaning Pakistan has GST of 20%. Locally, US will see it as a VAT, see it as a tariff on US products. Now you can argue whether that's true or not, but that's what they are positioning themselves as. And obviously Pakistan and other countries are not the target. The target here is Europe, which has a very significant internal GST level. So in the next few weeks, it will be important to see what kind of reciprocal tariffs are put in place. And if GST and VAT are added, we are likely to see a significant outbreak of trade war, which requires and will probably see retaliation from Europe. Now, what's happening with China? So China actually has gotten a very soft treatment so far from the US, with only a 10% increase in tariffs announced so far, but we think that will change. On the 1st of April, the ongoing investigations on China will be ending, and we are likely to see another phase of tariffs on China. And you can see China goods imports from US by sector as well, because China is obviously retaliating. So far, they have retaliated very narrowly and in a very contained manner, but that retaliation can also broaden out. But that said, that also produces opportunities for other countries, because tariff rates or steady state tariff rates on China are likely to be much higher than the rest of the world. And that has got to do with US-China decoupling, the great power rivalry we are going through. Another point I just want to quickly mention is US immigration. Not a lot is covered outside of US media here, but I think there are a couple of international implications. Firstly, US is cracking down on immigration very hard. The arrest rates are multiple times last year. In fact, now they are touching 1,000 a day. There are some short-term constraints on how quickly they can deport people, but we are expecting the flow of new immigration to the US to almost collapse to zero level. They have already seen numbers collapse on the southern border, but more importantly, they are cracking down on immigrants which are already economically active. So around 20%, or at least the documented numbers are around 20% of agriculture workforce is illegal in the US. I think the real numbers are likely to be higher. Similarly, for 20% in construction, around 8% in leisure and hospitality. This can be a serious inflation shock for the US. And why does it matter for the world is because it can make the Fed hawkish. And there's a serious risk the Fed will have to start hiking again in the later part of this year. And as I mentioned, this is not a cost-free exercise for the US as well, and it will be important to see how the Trump administration responds to any signs of inflation which come through. But what else matters in the long term? And I think Minister Aurangzeb Saab talked about demographics and climate change. And I would like to share some numbers just to highlight, and I think he's completely right. Pakistan's existential threats pass through these two dimensions. But let's look at the UN Center projections. So by 2040, Pakistan's population is projected to be 323 million, so the fourth largest in the world. India will be by far the largest country in terms of population, 1.6 billion. China will see a significant decline in population. And by the end of the century, we are nearing 500 million, but a significant decline continues in China. And then, of course, a decline starts to happen in India as well. Now, there are a lot of assumptions here. Even for US, the assumption is towards ongoing immigration, which is quite questionable right now. But certainly for Pakistan, managing this population growth, A, B, the health points Minister Saab mentioned, but also the skill and assets that, or the strength that population gives you cannot be underestimated, especially in a world where power and sovereignty actually matter. Now, that's the bad news. So these are modeling exercises which we used in 2020, and we published a lot of work on it. This is what is called a damage function approach. I know this is much more, this area is much more seeped into Pakistan, and there's much more awareness, especially after the floods in 2022. But these numbers we were estimating in 2020. And according to these damage functions, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh are one of the most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of the damage to the GDP versus baselines, as a result of loss of arable land, as a loss of access to water, and so on and so forth. Now, these are not just modeling exercises. Obviously, they are risk management exercises. Of course, we have to think about mitigation and adaptation. But let's not forget that this kind of collapse in GDP in a nuclear-powered country has massive implications. In fact, when we model the implications on Europe, and we have done a lot of elaborate studies on that, the risk to Europe, for example, doesn't come from climate change's direct impact on Europe, but it comes from collapse of one of these major countries and the immigration flow or the migration flow that can trigger. That is where Europe's vulnerability starts to come into play. But it's important, of course, that this topic remains top of mind for Pakistan, even though in the developed world, especially in the US, there is a massive retrenchment going on. Now I'm going to conclude by saying that, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate about this, and already this debate has started with what is happening between US and Europe and US and China will probably get another big boost once we start seeing the results of the Russia-Ukraine settlement. Once the focus moves on to Greenland, and of course, let's not forget the Gaza potential plan. So all of this together, Francis Fukuyama, if you remember his piece, The End of History, which he wrote in 1989, basically saying that liberal democracies are the final future of mankind. I think I'm pretty confident to say that he was wrong, because history never died. And it is coming back with vengeance. And the most important feature of that history coming back is that muscle will once again matter. So, Return of the Titans, and I asked the question, can Pakistan be won? Well, there are opportunities, and I agree with any shock to the system, that there are opportunities in an economically neutral paradigm where security and alliances matter more. It's as simple as that. There are going to be some countries which will never trust another country, no matter what economic and competitive price you give them. Technology, especially AI, is moving at a speed which we can't even fathom, I believe. But what is AI doing is that adoption costs are falling sharply. So productive services sector integration can now happen beyond English-speaking countries. So i.e. opening up your markets. I think there are a couple of more immediate observations I want to make. In my view, the freelance model is going to die very quickly in the next 2 to 3 years as AI picks up. Which means critically that we have to upgrade our skills, rethink our education programs, rethink our, what are the skills we need in our future generation. The other one is that skilled migration flow to developed world is going to collapse pretty soon as well. US population grew by 1% in the last fiscal year. 98% of that was due to immigrants. Currently, the flow of illegal immigrants to the US under the Trump administration 2.0 since 20th of Jan, because we have to obviously track this data daily, has collapsed by 99%. And you will very soon see skilled immigration completely cut off to the US, very soon followed by UK, or at least in sectors which are relevant to the UK. Of course, reform in the UK is polling higher than Labour right now, which has a very strong view on immigration. But certainly, these are interesting trends. Now, whether they are permanent or not, I think that's a good question to ask, because the demographic profiles of the West is that the population declines are quite sharp in the absence of immigration. But what I do think is what we need is scale and enterprise level operations. This is not freelance, is not going to bail Pakistan out. I mean, you can create pictures out of it and posters, but it's not going to help. The reliability of supply chain dimension, I think, is a very important dimension, which means that external sector value proposition is going to move beyond pure economics. Well, we need to understand, what does the world need? The world needs different things now. Europe needs defense. So as I mentioned, potentially up to $700 billion euros of external, additional defense spending coming through. In fact, we see UK as a big, player in that setup. US needs China diversification, and China needs dependable allies in a world which is stretching out. I think the role of big businesses is underestimated. In exports, SMEs don't stand a chance. Capital market enablers, of course. I mean, China has done it very effectively, and states and private sector partnerships is going to be key. In fact, what China calls public and private fusion strategies. And then lastly, climate change, demographics, and turning into this titan of this new age, I think, at least to my mind, will determine our destiny, which is more likely to be a choice, I agree, rather than just the flow of the tides. I'm going to end by two uplifting notes and one cautionary tale. The first uplifting note. In 1560, under the reign of Akbar the Great, Lahore was made the capital of the Mughal Empire. So it moved from Fatehpur Sikri to Lahore. When I heard this fact, I was shocked. So Lahore, in 1560, was the most advanced city on the face of the planet. No city in Europe or Asia could compete with Lahore. It is said that every craft the human mind could think of was practiced in Lahore at that time. And the uplifting note is that we are the children of the same civilization. It was a civilization which had self-worth and dominated its time. I'm not talking about strong, I'm talking about dominant of its time. So that's the uplifting note. Now the cautionary note is that fast forward 200 years, 1757, Clive of India. Clive of India defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla with an army of 3,000. And out of those 3,000, only 900 people or 900 individuals were Europeans or white. Siraj-ud-Dawla had an army of 50,000. So an army of 3,000 defeated an army of 50,000. Why, one must ask. Three things. Technology. You don't keep pace on technology, you are done. Two, Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar turned on Siraj-ud-Dawla. Unity. Number three, preparation. Clive of India and his forces covered their gunpowder when it rained. Siraj-ud-Dawla's army didn't. Preparation matters. So that's the cautionary tale. So 200 years into 1757. And then lastly, the last uplifting point I would share before I get locked up. And this is a Chinese proverb, and I'm paraphrasing it, but I love this proverb. It says, those who are united are destined to divide. And those who are divided are destined to unite. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an uplifting note because Pakistan and Global South, luckily, is in the second camp. With that, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.